The spotlight blazed down on the figure in the shimmering red sequin dress, every crystal catching the light like flames dancing across the stage. Diamond Delacroix struck a pose that sent the packed nightclub into thunderous applause, blonde hair cascading in perfect waves, makeup flawless under the harsh theater lights. This was the moment she lived for, the roar of the crowd, the validation, the escape from everything that hurt too much to remember. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, there was a small girl sitting in the front row, clutching a worn black book against her chest, her innocent eyes fixed not on the performance but on something deeper, something that made Diamond's carefully constructed facade begin to crack. Peace and grace to you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. How are you today? May you be healthy, joyful, and filled with God's blessings. Hello, friends in faith. Welcome back to the Vault of Faith channel. If this message blesses you, please support us by clicking like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's dive into today's story. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a black t-shirt with a small silver cross pendant that caught the stage lights. She sat perfectly still while the adults around her cheered and whistled, her small hands gripping that book like it contained the secrets of the universe. Diamond had performed in front of thousands, had commanded stages across the country, but something about this one child's presence made her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with performance adrenaline. Marcus Williams, the man behind Diamond Delacroix, had been performing drag for 15 years, ever since he fled his small hometown and the suffocating expectations of his deeply religious family. His father had been a pastor, his mother a Sunday school teacher, and when they discovered their son's truth, the words they spoke cut deeper than any blade. The rejection had driven him to the bright lights and accepting arms of the drag community, where he could be celebrated for exactly who he was. Diamond became his armor, his shield, his way of surviving in a world that seemed determined to crush anyone who dared to be different. But tonight, as he lip-synced to the pounding beat of the music, his eyes kept drifting back to that little girl. She wasn't laughing or clapping like the others. Instead, she seemed to be studying him with an intensity that made his skin crawl and his heart ache simultaneously. There was something in her gaze, not judgment, not curiosity, but something that felt almost like recognition, like she could see straight through the glitter and glamour to the wounded soul beneath. The song ended, and Diamond took her bow, the crowd erupting in appreciation. Tips rained down on the stage like confetti, and the familiar rush of validation flooded through him. But as he bent to collect the money, his eyes met the child's again, and she did something that stopped his world completely. She opened the book in her lap and began to read, her lips moving silently, her finger tracing along the page. Even over the noise of the crowd, even with the music still echoing in his ears, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. The little girl's grandmother. He assumed it was her grandmother from the way the elderly woman's arm wrapped protectively around her, leaned down and whispered something in her ear. The child nodded solemnly, then closed the book and stood up. For a moment, Marcus thought they were leaving, and he felt an unexpected pang of loss. But instead, the girl took a step forward, right up to the edge of the stage where Diamond stood in all her glittering glory. The crowd around them continued their revelry, but it felt like a bubble of silence had formed around the three of them, the drag queen, the child, and the elderly woman who watched with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The little girl looked up at Diamond with eyes that held no fear, no disgust, no judgment, only something that looked suspiciously like love. "Miss Diamond," the child said in a voice so clear it seemed to cut through all the noise. "My name is Sarah, and I have something I need to tell you." Marcus felt his carefully constructed walls begin to tremble. 15 years of armor, 15 years of protection, 15 years of building Diamond into an impenetrable fortress of confidence and sass, all of it started to crack at the sound of one small voice saying his stage name with such gentle respect. "What is it, sweetheart?" Diamond managed to say, her voice catching slightly as she knelt down to the child's level, the sequin dress pooling around her like liquid fire. Sarah held up the book, and now Marcus could see it was a Bible, its pages worn soft from countless readings, its cover faded from loving hands. "I wanted to read you something," she said simply. Something I think you need to hear. The world seemed to stop spinning. The music, the crowd, the flashing lights, everything faded into background noise as this little girl with her simple faith and her grandmother's encouraging hand on her shoulder prepared to speak words that would change everything. Marcus could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, could taste the metallic tang of fear in his mouth, could sense that whatever happened next would either destroy him completely or set him free in ways he'd never imagined possible. Sarah opened the Bible to a page that was clearly marked, her small finger finding the verse she'd been looking for. She took a deep breath, looked up at Diamond with eyes that sparkled with unshed tears, and prepared to speak the words that would shatter 15 years of carefully constructed identity and begin the most terrifying, beautiful transformation of Marcus Williams' life. Sarah's finger traced the familiar words on the page, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that seemed impossible for someone so young. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you hope and a future." The words hung in the air like a prayer, cutting through the chaos of the nightclub with surgical precision. Marcus felt something inside his chest crack open, not break, but crack like an egg about to hatch, like a seed about to sprout, like a heart about to remember what it felt like to hope. The little girl's grandmother stepped closer, her weathered hand reaching up to touch Diamond's glittering cheek. "Child," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "do you know that God has been looking for you? He's been calling your name, waiting for you to come home." The old woman's eyes held decades of wisdom, of loss, of faith tested by fire and found genuine. "My Sarah here. She's been praying for you every night for 3 months. Ever since she saw you perform at the community center fundraiser." Marcus's mind reeled. 3 months? This child had been praying for him for 3 months? The community center fundraiser, he remembered that night. It had been a charity event for local families in need, and Diamond had donated her time and talent to help raise money. He'd thought it was just another gig, another chance to bring joy to people who needed it. But this little girl had been there, had seen him, had somehow looked past the makeup and the costume to see something worth praying for. "I don't understand," Diamond whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding music. "Why would you pray for me? You don't even know me." Sarah's smile was radiant, transforming her young face into something that seemed to glow from within. "Because Jesus told me to. When I was praying one night, asking him who needed his love the most, he showed me your face. Not Diamond's face, but your real face, the one behind all the pretty makeup. And he told me that you were hurting, that you needed someone to remind you that you're loved just as you are." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Just as you are. When was the last time someone had said that to him? When was the last time someone had looked at him? Not Diamond, not the performance, but him, and said he was enough? His father's voice echoed in his memory. "You're an abomination, Marcus. You're lost. And if you don't change, you'll drag this whole family down with you." His mother's tears, her whispered pleas for him to just be normal, to just pretend, to just hide who he was for the sake of their reputation. The crowd around them was growing restless, waiting for the next act, but Marcus couldn't move. He was frozen in this moment, trapped between the life he'd built and the possibility of something he'd never dared to dream of. Sarah reached up and gently touched his hand, her small fingers impossibly warm against his skin. "Can I tell you something else?" she asked, her voice so gentle it made his heart ache. "My daddy left when I was little, and for a long time I thought it was because I wasn't good enough. But Grandma taught me that sometimes people leave because they're hurting, not because we're bad. And Jesus, he never leaves. Not ever. Not even when we can't feel him there." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes, threatening to destroy his carefully applied makeup. This child, this innocent, beautiful child, was speaking directly to wounds he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. The abandonment, the rejection, the bone-deep certainty that he was fundamentally flawed, fundamentally unlovable. But here she was, this little messenger, telling him that God hadn't forgotten him, that God was still calling his name. "I can't," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You don't understand what I've done, who I've become. I'm not the kind of person God wants." Sarah's grandmother laughed softly, a sound full of joy and recognition. Child, if God only wanted perfect people, he wouldn't want any of us. You think your struggles are too big for his love? You think your pain is too deep for his healing? He specializes in broken things, in lost sheep, in prodigal children who think they've wandered too far to come home. The music changed, signaling the next act, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to move. He was Diamond Delacroix, the queen of the stage, the embodiment of confidence and sass. But right now, he felt like a scared little boy who'd been lost in the woods for 15 years and had finally heard someone calling his name. The little girl reached into her grandmother's purse and pulled out a small card, pressing it into his palm. "This is our church," Sarah said simply. "We're there every Sunday at 10 in the morning, and every Wednesday night for Bible study. You don't have to be anyone special to come, just yourself. Whatever that looks like." She paused, studying his face with those impossibly wise eyes. "I'll be looking for you, okay? Not Diamond. You. The real you that God loves so much he sent a little girl to remind you." Marcus looked down at the card in his hand, the simple white rectangle that seemed to weigh more than all of his costumes combined. Grace Baptist Church, the address written in neat script below. Such a simple thing, such an ordinary invitation. But it felt like a key, like a door opening to a room he'd forgotten existed. "I have to go," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The show must go on. But as he stood up, smoothing down his sequin dress, Sarah reached up and touched his arm one more time. "Marcus," she said softly, and the sound of his real name on her lips nearly undid him completely. "God sees you. Not Diamond, not the performance, not the person you think you have to be. He sees Marcus, and he loves what he sees. Don't forget that. Okay?" The grandmother and the little girl began to make their way through the crowd, but Marcus couldn't take his eyes off them. Just before they reached the exit, Sarah turned back one more time and gave him a small wave. In that gesture, in that simple acknowledgement, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. He felt seen. He felt known. And for the first time since he'd fled his hometown and built his glittering fortress of self-protection, Marcus Williams felt like maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to come home. The drive home felt like traveling through a different universe. Marcus sat in his car outside his apartment building, still wearing the red sequin dress, his makeup smeared from the tears he couldn't stop. The business card lay on his dashboard like a beacon, its simple white surface reflecting the streetlight above. Grace Baptist Church. He'd driven past it 100 times without really seeing it, just another building in a city full of buildings. But now it felt like a destination, like a place that had been waiting for him all along. Inside his apartment, Marcus stood before his bedroom mirror, studying the face that looked back at him. Diamond's false eyelashes hung crooked. Her lipstick had long since disappeared, and mascara streaked down her cheeks like war paint. But underneath it all, he could see something he'd almost forgotten existed. He could see Marcus Williams, the scared kid who'd once sung hymns in his father's church, who'd once believed that God loved him unconditionally, who'd once thought he might grow up to be a pastor like his dad. The makeup came off slowly, each wipe of the cloth revealing more of the man beneath. The transformation was always the hardest part, not putting Diamond on, but taking her off. Without her armor, without her confidence, without her larger-than-life personality, Marcus felt exposed and vulnerable. The silence of his apartment pressed in around him, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren wailing through the night. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he'd been avoiding for 3 years. His finger hovered over his sister Rebecca's name, the only member of his family who'd continued to reach out after their parents had made their final ultimatum. She'd texted him faithfully every month, sharing little updates about her life, her husband, her kids. Her messages always ended the same way. "I love you, and I'm praying for you. Come home when you're ready." The phone rang twice before her sleepy voice answered. "Marcus? Is that you? It's 3 in the morning. Becca," he whispered, his voice cracking on her name. "I think I'm ready." There was a long pause, and he could hear her sitting up in bed, could picture her running her hand through her hair the way she always did when she was thinking. Ready for what, sweetheart? To come home. To stop running. To remember who I was before I became so afraid of who I am. The words tumbled out of him like water through a broken dam. A little girl spoke to me tonight, Becca. She knew my name, my real name, and she said God's been looking for me. His sister's sob was audible through the phone. Oh, Marcus, I've been waiting for this call for so long. Tell me everything. He told her about Sarah, about the Bible verse, about the grandmother's weathered hands and wise eyes. He told her about the card on his dashboard and the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. Rebecca listened without interruption, occasionally making soft sounds of understanding and encouragement. She sounds like an angel, Rebecca said when he finished. God has a way of using the most unexpected messengers, doesn't he? Marcus looked at his reflection in the darkened window, seeing not Diamond's glamorous silhouette but his own ordinary face, tired and searching. I'm scared, Becca. What if I go to that church and they reject me? What if I'm too far gone? What if Dad was right about me? Dad was wrong, Rebecca said firmly. He was hurt and scared and didn't know how to love you through his own fear. But God isn't like Dad, Marcus. God's love doesn't come with conditions. And if that little girl is right, if God's been looking for you, then he's not going to slam the door in your face when you finally knock. The next morning, Marcus woke to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and the sound of church bells ringing somewhere in the distance. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the familiar weight of dread that usually accompanied Sunday mornings. Instead, he felt something that might have been anticipation, tinged with terror and hope in equal measure. He dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt like Marcus rather than Diamond. Simple jeans, a navy blue button-down shirt, clean sneakers. He looked in the mirror and saw a man who might belong in a church, who might not immediately be recognized as the glittering queen who commanded stages across the city. The thought brought both relief and a strange sense of loss. The drive to Grace Baptist Church took 15 minutes, but it felt like traveling across decades. Marcus parked across the street and sat watching families walk up the front steps, children in their Sunday best, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers looking vaguely uncomfortable in their dress clothes. They all seemed to belong in ways that Marcus wasn't sure he remembered how to. Then he saw her, Sarah, wearing a yellow sundress and holding her grandmother's hand, walking slowly up the church steps. She paused at the top and turned around, scanning the street as if she were looking for someone. When her eyes found his car, her face broke into a smile so bright it could have powered the whole city. She said something to her grandmother, who looked across the street and nodded encouragingly. Sarah raised her hand in a small wave, not demanding that he come, not pressuring him to move, just acknowledging that she saw him and was glad he was there. The gesture was so full of acceptance, so free of expectation, that Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion. He turned off the engine and sat in the silence, his heart pounding against his ribs. The church bells had stopped ringing, and he could hear the faint sound of music beginning inside. A hymn he recognized from his childhood, words he'd once known by heart. The melody drifted through the morning air like a prayer, like an invitation, like a hand reaching out to a lost child who'd finally found the courage to come home. Marcus opened the car door and stepped out into the sunshine, feeling the weight of 15 years of running settle on his shoulders. But underneath the fear, underneath the uncertainty, he felt something else beginning to stir. Something that might have been hope, might have been faith, might have been the first tentative steps of a prodigal son finally turning his face toward home. The church doors stood open, and through them, Marcus could see the warm glow of stained glass windows and the silhouettes of people gathered in worship. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. God sees you, not Diamond, not the performance, not the person you think you have to be. He sees Marcus, and he loves what he sees. Taking a deep breath, Marcus Williams began walking toward the church, toward the little girl who'd been praying for him, toward the God who'd never stopped calling his name. Marcus's hand trembled as he reached for the heavy wooden door of Grace Baptist Church. The sanctuary was fuller than he'd expected, with warm morning light streaming through stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. The congregation was singing an old hymn he remembered from childhood, their voices rising and falling in practiced harmony. He slipped into the back row, hoping to remain invisible, but Sarah's grandmother caught his eye from 3 rows up and smiled with such radiant joy that several people turned to see what had captured her attention. The pastor was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and graying hair, wearing a simple suit that had seen better days. When the singing ended, he stepped up to the pulpit with the easy confidence of someone who'd been sharing God's word for decades. "Before we dive into today's message," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sanctuary, "I want to share something beautiful that happened this week. Sometimes God uses the smallest among us to reach the hearts that need him most." Marcus felt his stomach drop as the pastor's eyes found his in the back row. But instead of the judgment he expected, he saw only warmth and welcome. "Miss Sarah here has been faithfully praying for someone special, and I understand that person honored us with their presence today. Wherever you are, friend, know that you're not here by accident. God has been orchestrating this moment long before you realized you needed it." Sarah stood up in her yellow sundress and turned around, her eyes searching the congregation until they landed on Marcus. Her smile was incandescent, and she gave him a small wave that made his heart skip. Around her, other members of the congregation began to turn, following her gaze. Marcus braced himself for the stares, the whispers, the recognition that would surely follow. But instead, he saw faces full of curiosity and welcome, people who seemed genuinely glad to see a newcomer in their midst. "Our message today comes from Luke chapter 15. The pastor continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The parable of the prodigal son. It's a story about a young man who thought he'd wandered too far from home to ever return, about a father who never stopped watching the road, and about a love that defies every human understanding of forgiveness and grace." As the pastor began to read, Marcus felt the words washing over him like water over parched ground. The story of the son who demanded his inheritance, who left home in search of something he couldn't name, who squandered everything and found himself eating with pigs. But more than that, it was the story of the father who saw his son coming from a long way off, who ran to meet him, who threw his arms around him and called for a celebration. "Some of you here today might identify with that young man," the pastor said, his eyes finding Marcus again. "You might feel like you've made choices that put you beyond the reach of God's love. You might think you've built walls so high that even the Almighty can't climb them. But I'm here to tell you that God's love is bigger than your mistakes, stronger than your shame, and more persistent than your fear." Marcus felt tears beginning to well up in his eyes. This was the message he'd needed to hear 15 years ago, when his father had stood in their living room and declared that he no longer had a son. This was the grace he'd been searching for in every spotlight, every performance, every moment of validation from strangers who saw only diamonds' glittering exterior. The pastor's voice grew more passionate as he continued. "The beautiful thing about this story isn't just that the son came home. It's that the father was already looking for him, already waiting, already preparing to run toward him the moment he appeared on the horizon. God doesn't wait for us to clean ourselves up before he welcomes us home. He meets us in our mess, in our brokenness, in our desperate need for something real." Around the sanctuary, Marcus could see people nodding, dabbing at their eyes, reaching for their neighbors' hands. This wasn't the fire and brimstone preaching he remembered from his childhood. This was something softer, something that felt like coming home after a long journey through the wilderness. When the service ended, Marcus tried to slip out quickly, but Sarah's grandmother intercepted him in the aisle. "You came?" she said simply, reaching up to touch his arm. "I wasn't sure you would, but here you are." "I almost didn't," Marcus admitted, looking around at the congregation as they slowly filed out, children running between the pews, adults gathering in small groups to chat. "I'm not sure I belong here, child," the grandmother said with a laugh that was full of warmth. "None of us belong here. That's exactly why we need to be here. Come on, let me introduce you to Pastor Williams. He's been hoping to meet you." The irony of the pastor's name wasn't lost on Marcus as he found himself face to face with the man who'd just delivered the most powerful sermon he'd heard in years. Pastor Williams gripped his hand firmly, his eyes crinkling with genuine pleasure. "Marcus, right? Sarah's been telling me about you. I understand you're in entertainment." "I'm a drag performer," Marcus said, waiting for the familiar look of disapproval or discomfort. Instead, Pastor Williams nodded thoughtfully. "That takes real courage," he said. "Standing up in front of people, bearing your soul, trying to bring joy to others. I imagine it's not always easy." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "Would you like to have coffee sometime this week? I'd love to hear your story, and I think you might enjoy hearing mine. I wasn't always a pastor, you know. I've got a few chapters in my past that might surprise you." Before Marcus could respond, Sarah appeared at his elbow, still glowing with excitement. "Marcus, you came. I prayed you would, but I was still worried you might be too scared." She slipped her small hand into his, completely unconscious of the way several adults turned to watch this interaction between the famous drag queen and the little girl who'd captured his heart. "I was scared," Marcus admitted, kneeling down to her level. "I'm still scared, but you know what? Sometimes the most important things we do are the ones that scare us the most." Sarah's face grew serious, her young features taking on that preternatural wisdom that had first captivated him. "Jesus was scared too, you know, in the garden before he went to the cross. But he did it anyway because love is stronger than fear. And God's love for you is stronger than anything you're afraid of." Marcus felt something inside his chest shift and settle, like a bone that had been dislocated for years finally snapping back into place. This child, this beautiful, innocent child, was speaking truth that cut through 15 years of self-protection and defensive armor. In her simple faith, in her grandmother's weathered wisdom, in Pastor Williams's gentle acceptance, Marcus was beginning to see the face of a God who looked nothing like the angry, disappointed father he'd been running from. "Will you come back next week?" Sarah asked, her eyes bright with hope. "I'm going to keep praying for you every day, but it would be even better if you were here with us." Marcus looked around the sanctuary one more time, taking in the faces of people who'd welcomed him without question, who'd made space for him in their midst, who'd shown him what grace looked like in action. For the first time in 15 years, he felt like he might be ready to stop running and start the long journey home. "Yes," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. "I'll be here." The weeks that followed felt like watching a metamorphosis in slow motion. Marcus found himself counting down the days until Sunday, marking his calendar like a child anticipating Christmas morning. Each service peeled away another layer of the protective shell he'd built around his heart, revealing parts of himself he'd forgotten existed. Pastor Williams had become a regular fixture in his life, their weekly coffee meetings stretching into hours of conversation about faith, identity, and the complicated dance between who God made us to be and who the world tells us we should become. It was during one of these conversations that Marcus finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in his chest for weeks. "What happens to Diamond?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been her for so long. I don't know who I am without her. And the community, they depend on me. I raise money for homeless shelters. I perform at fundraisers. I help people who have nowhere else to turn. If I walk away from all of that, what happens to the people who need Diamond?" Pastor Williams smiled, the kind of smile that held decades of wisdom and hard-won understanding. "Marcus, who says you have to walk away? Who says God can't use every part of your story, every gift he's given you, every platform he's allowed you to build? The question isn't whether Diamond disappears. It's whether Diamond can be redeemed, transformed, used for something bigger than entertainment." The idea had never occurred to Marcus. He'd been thinking in terms of before and after, old life and new life, as if faith meant erasing everything that had come before. But sitting in that coffee shop, watching Pastor Williams sketch out a vision of ministry that looked nothing like traditional church work, Marcus began to see possibilities he'd never imagined. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow dance between the man Marcus was becoming and the performer he'd always been. He started incorporating subtle changes into his shows, Moments of genuine connection with the audience, brief testimonies about hope and acceptance, fundraising efforts that focused on supporting LGBTQ+ youth who'd been rejected by their families. Diamond was still Diamond, but she was beginning to carry something deeper, something that transcended entertainment and touched the realm of ministry. Sarah noticed the change immediately. She'd become a regular fixture at his performances, always accompanied by her grandmother, always carrying her worn Bible. But now she watched with different eyes that sparkled with recognition when Marcus would pause between songs to share a word of encouragement with someone in the crowd who looked lost or hurting. It was at a Pride festival 6 months after their first meeting that everything came together. Marcus had been invited to perform at the main stage, but instead of his usual high-energy dance numbers, he found himself standing in front of thousands of people, still in full Diamond regalia, holding a microphone and speaking words that seemed to come from somewhere beyond himself. "I want to tell you about a little girl who changed my life," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "She saw me at my most glittering, my most confident, my most put-together moment, and somehow she knew that underneath all of this, I was broken. She didn't try to fix me or change me or make me into someone else. She just loved me exactly as I was and reminded me that God loves me exactly as I am too." The crowd had grown quiet. Thousands of people who'd come expecting entertainment finding themselves witnessing something that felt more like a testimony than a performance. Marcus could see Sarah in the front row, her grandmother's arm around her shoulders, both of them crying openly as he shared his story. "Some of you here today have been told that you have to choose between your faith and your identity," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Some of you have been rejected by families, by churches, by communities that claim to love God but couldn't love you. I'm here to tell you that God's love is bigger than their rejection, stronger than their fear, and more persistent than their judgment." He pulled out the business card that had started it all, now worn soft from being carried in his wallet for months. "This is the church that welcomed me exactly as I was. Not the church that demanded I change first, not the church that tolerated me, but the church that celebrated me. And if you're looking for a place where your faith and your identity can coexist, where you can be loved for exactly who God made you to be, then maybe it's time to come home." The response was overwhelming. People rushed the stage, not for autographs or photos, but for hope. They shared their stories, their pain, their desperate longing for a faith that felt bigger than the small, angry God they'd been presented with. Marcus found himself praying with drag queens and leather daddies, with transgender teenagers and their supportive parents, with people who'd been wandering in the wilderness of spiritual homelessness for years. Sarah appeared at his side during the chaos, her small hand slipping into his as she watched him minister to person after person. "This is what I saw," she said simply, her voice filled with wonder. "When I was praying for you, this is what Jesus showed me. Not you changing into someone else, but you becoming more yourself than you'd ever been." 3 years later, Marcus stood in the same sanctuary where he'd first encountered grace. But now he was wearing clerical robes instead of sequins. The ceremony had been beautiful, his ordination as a minister of outreach and inclusion witnessed by his sister Rebecca, by Sarah and her grandmother, by Pastor Williams, and by dozens of people whose lives had been transformed by the ministry that had grown from that first divine encounter. Diamond still performed regularly, but now her shows were infused with purpose beyond entertainment. She'd become a bridge between worlds, a translator of grace for people who'd been told they were too different, too broken, too far gone to be loved by God. The nightclub where it all began had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the rejected found acceptance, where the wandering found direction, where the spiritually homeless found family. Standing at the altar, Marcus looked out at the congregation and saw faces that represented every color of the rainbow, every walk of life, every story of redemption. In the front row, Sarah sat with her grandmother, now 13 years old but still carrying the same worn Bible that had started this whole journey. She caught his eye and smiled, that same radiant smile that had changed his life, and mouthed the words that had become their shared truth. "God sees you." If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect on your own journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Vault of Faith, and share it with someone who is searching for something deeper. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had a moment when faith became real for you? We read every message and would love to hear your story.